Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help executives thrive as cyber risk managers. Your hosts are Kip Boyle, Virtual Chief Information Security Officer at Cyber Risk Opportunities, and Jake Bernstein, Partner at the law firm of K&L Gates. Visit them at cr-map.com and klgates.com.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today in episode 130 of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast?
Oh, well, that's really coy because you know exactly what we're going to talk about. You actually requested this topic, and I think it's good. It might seem basic to the audience, but it really isn't. It's actually the source of a lot of healthy, let's say, creative tension in the community, and the topic is going to be defining and assessing risk. Oh, my gosh.
Oh, man. And you know, it's funny. I think if anyone does think it's basic, well, just wait for the next whoever. Nobody really knows exactly how long, but we'll continue. So the first thing is, I don't know. Maybe it's because we talk about this together off the podcast quite a bit. But have we specifically talked about this on the podcast before? I know that, and what's the genesis of this episode is a relatively recent episode where we had a guest, Karen Worstall, who and we really talked a lot about risk and assessment and management, and I really think that this one was inspired by both that, but also something else, and that is that we are starting to see the phrase risk assessment or assess your risk showing up in legislation and rules, regulations, as requirements. And, I have to say, Kip, but quite honestly, none of these statutes or rules go into any detail.
No.
And so let's just start with a seemingly basic question. Kip, what is risk?
Oh, man. Okay. Well, we are the Cyber Risk Management Podcast, so it's reasonable per se that that we would be able and willing to talk about this. So, all right. So it's not simple because risk as a term is really overloaded, right?
Oh,
So many of the terms that we need to use to get work done are completely overloaded. I mean, I could talk about risk and we could go to the racetrack. I could talk about risk and we could go to a construction site. I could talk about risk and we could watch a ship depart for a long overseas voyage, right? I mean, there's just so much packed into that word risk.
So you're saying, and I made this joke later in the script, but we can ignore it then. But so what you're saying is we have to define our terms, right, Kip? Is that what you're saying?
Our terms. Yeah. That's why I like hanging out with you.
I'm so excited.
That's what you like to do. You like to define terms also. So, and when I define terms, I like to go to NIST. I like the National Institute of Standards and Technology because that's what they do is they standardize. And so it's a good place to go. And I also like, in particular for this episode, we're going to look at NIST Special Publication 800-30 Release 1, which is called the Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments. And it's a really great document for a number of different reasons. And we'll unpack why during the course of the episode here.
Point of brief order. It's revision 1 as opposed to not really release 1. So technically it's release 2, Kip.
So do I sustain your objection? Is that how that works, or do I overrule it?
No, I think you sustain it in this case.
I sustain it. Okay, yeah, you sustained. Okay. Okay. So what's risk? All right, that's your question. Now I'm gonna give you the 800-30 answer. Risk is a measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event, and it is typically a function of 1, the adverse impacts that would arise if the circumstance or event occurs, and 2, the likelihood of occurrence. So you've got a little dynamic interplay there between those two ideas. And in our mode of operating, right, we really talk about information security risks or IT security risks, and those arise from the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information or of information systems. So, what do you think about that?
So that's I think that's a really, really helpful start. And for an extended discussion of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and the risks and the impacts of those, please go back and listen to our most recent Verizon DBIR episode, where the DBIR authors helpfully have started to focus in on that concept, and we do talk about that in our episode. So that's where you should go. And then second, Kip, I was thinking, like this, and we'll get. I promise that this will be clarified later on, but I want to start with what I thought was actually an interesting bit of confusion on my part. Is that I remembered from my CISSP studies that there are all kinds of little formulae that people use as shorthand for what you just said, and a couple or three of them are risk equals threat times vulnerability, or risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. And then sometimes people switch impact for cost. They're basically synonyms. And, that's, I suppose, more or less ish what you said, but it's not quite the same. And we can talk about why that is.
It's a derivation, right?
It is. It turns out, yeah, and we'll get to that. It does turn out to be a derivation. I think the NIST one is the better, more comprehensive, more technical definition. And I think that what makes this so difficult is that, the formulas I just gave, like, what do you do with that? Okay. Right. So yes, risk, I can sit there and impressively state to an audience that risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. But what?
How do you instantiate those variables?
Yes, exactly. First, what do those variables even mean?
Right. And what are the units?
And then, Kip, I have very helpfully left you an amazing, I think my favorite bit of scripting ever in this script, and I'm going to set it up for you, is don't you have to be able to measure this stuff if you're going to use those formula as they're presented?
Yeah. Yes, I appreciate this little digital soapbox that you've prepared for me, and do let me stand on it for a moment. So I've spent all my career in first it was called computer security, and then it was called network security, right? Going all the way back to the first stuff that I did in this career back in the 1990s. But I have studiously tried to discover and use a risk assessment methodology that was reliable, that I could actually depend on, and I never really found one. I went to classes. When I was on active duty, I went to sponsored training by the Department of Defense on how to do risk assessments, and none of it was really ever definitive. And so I just have to say that there's no easy, straightforward answer here. In fact, if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you probably know that I got so frustrated by this that I invented my own way of doing it, and which I really like, and we'll talk more about that later on. But there's if you love math and you like advanced statistics and you're good at explaining those kinds of concepts like Monte Carlo simulations and probabilities and that sort of thing, then by all means embrace that, because that's probably the best choice. Unfortunately, what I find is that very few people actually want that. Certainly nobody with money to spend in my world has ever asked me to bring advanced mathematics into risk measurement. I know some organizations do it, and God bless them, but it's really difficult and it's very resource intensive. And unfortunately, the red, yellow, green stuff, I learned very, very early that spending a lot of money on doing red, yellow, green is a bad idea, because I can back of the envelope, a quick qualitative analysis and get pretty much what I'd get if I did it over the course of a month and involved a lot of people and spent a lot of money. So there you go.
All right. So we're going to get to risk assessment methodologies, but it sounds like we've preemptively shot down the quantitative approach and the qualitative approach.
Well, just please remember, it depends on what you want. If you're okay with math, and if your senior decision makers are okay with math, like if you work for an engineering firm or something like that, then going to something like FAIR, which is very math intensive and statistics intensive. Doug Hubbard has several wonderful books that talk about how to measure cyber risk. And again, very math intensive. If you can embrace it and make it work for you, again, God bless you. But it's just not something that I have seen a lot of.
Yeah, and it's not going to be fast. It's not going to be cheap.
No, and the quality of the inputs are everything.
So garbage in, garbage out is always the rule. If you're not careful.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that we have discussed that as briefly as we can. So let's go ahead and move forward here.
Sure.
Let's look at the 4 components, and I realize I'm taking your spot, but that's all right because that's how things go. One other NIST publication that I want to bring up for people. So we already mentioned NIST special publication 800-30, which is currently in revision 1.
And is a good one, by the way.
It's a good one.
Reference.
It is. Very good reference. But there's another one that's NIST SP 800-39, which is about the risk management process. And it's got a lot of detail in there. And we're not going to go into that.
Can I just say really quickly that risk management and risk assessment is not the same. Those are not synonyms. Please don't get confused.
It's not, and I'm about to say that. You're going to find out. So this is where sometimes I wish, Kip, that we had really done our video podcast, not because I want people to see me in the morning when we're recording, but because every so often a visual aid would be helpful. So I'd like, dear listener, imagine a triangle. At the top point, you have assess. At the bottom right point, you have respond. And then the other point is monitor. Now in the center, add in a circle or whatever you want and label it frame. Now all 3 of the vertexes, the external points, connect to the center, the frame. And what we're trying to do here is describe the risk management process diagrams that you can find in 830 and 39. But the idea that I want you to do is to think about risk management, and I say that's intentional, not assessment, risk management, as a process, and a continuous one at that, with full of these wonderful internal feedback loops that continually make adjustments as facts and circumstances evolve. So that's kind of where I want you to start. And Kip, you really said something that's super important. And look, it's right there for you.
Yeah. Is that, again, risk management and risk assessment, not the same. But you have to be able to assess risk if you want to manage it somehow. But we're not going to talk about risk management. We're going to continue to focus on risk assessment. But I like the idea of maybe coming back and doing another episode later on risk management. And I actually think there's a lot more useful guidance on risk management than there is in general on risk assessment. So yeah. Hey, let's tackle the hard thing first. Why not?
Yeah, let's do it. I think it's great. And that's interesting, right? Risk assessment. Why do we care? Right? Why do we care? That's not a rhetorical question.
No, it's a really important practical question, which is why I spent so many years going to all kinds of trainings, reading all kinds of books, getting laughed at. And I'm not kidding. I would try different risk assessment ideas, and I would bring them to senior decision makers. And sometimes, they were never really mean to me, but they'd smirk, right? Because they're just like, dude, what are you doing? This doesn't make any sense to us. And
the enthusiasm of young Kip.
So it's an important question, and you have to figure out some way to assess risk, or you just don't know how to invest your limited resources against your unlimited risks that are coming at you. This is a huge pillar of how I work with senior decision makers and frame up, the issue. And there's a lot at stake. Oh my gosh, there's so much at stake. Either you're just not getting business value for the money you're spending, or you are going to have this false sense of security but you're going to be, completely open for ultimate failure in the worst case.
So it would be fair to say then that a poor risk assessment methodology is at best going to lead to just major inefficiencies.
Yeah.
But at worst, complete failure. And as I mentioned at the start, from the legal standpoint, there is a growing body of law that actually requires and uses the phrase risk assessment.
Yes.
And as I also mentioned, none of the laws go into great detail about how you assess risk. And that's the point of this episode. So, we know that the risk management process is about framing the issues and assessing, monitoring, and responding over time. The rest of this is that assess bubble. So let's do what we can here in the remainder of the episode and try to figure out, what does it mean to assess risk?
I almost feel like you're getting me back for some slight. I don't know why. I don't know why I feel that way. Why should I feel annoyed because you keep asking me simple questions for which there is no simple answer?
Well, to be fair, it's a really hard question.
It is a really hard question. But I'm going to go back to 800-30. And the reason why is because in the back of that document is a really helpful appendix. Do they call it an appendix? I don't know what they call it. Anyway, in the back of that document, there's actually a list of risk assessment techniques that they approve of. And there's all kinds of stuff in there. The things that we often hear about, as well as a lot of things we don't often hear about. And I'll just give you one quick example. A gap analysis is considered to be a legitimate risk assessment technique according to Special Publication 800-30. So if anybody tells you that a gap analysis is not a risk assessment, no, maybe for them it's not, but it can be according to NIST, which I think is very powerful and useful. But okay, but what does 800-30 actually say? About risk assessments. And what it says is that they're not simply one-time activities that provide permanent and definitive information for decision makers. You can't just do it once and expect that the results will guide and inform their responses to information security risks forever. It's too dynamic, right? Cyber is a dynamic risk. We've talked about that so many times. So as a result, again, straight out of Special Publication 800-30, organizations need to employ risk assessments on an ongoing basis throughout the system development lifecycle. If we're talking about, systems that we're creating, or the systems acquisition lifecycle, if we're actually buying systems to use, which of course, cloud computing, people are buying stuff rather than making it themselves more and more. And you have to do this across all of the tiers in the risk management hierarchy. So that's what Special Publication 800-30 says. I'm totally on board with that, of course. And the takeaway, assessing risk is an ongoing, not a one-time thing.
And the other thing that just occurs to me, Kip, is that, one of the things that, obviously, we've said why you should do it, right? Mm-hmm. But I think you just said one of the most important factors here, or one of the most important concepts, which is, what is the actual purpose of it? And it is to provide information for decision makers so that, they can be guided and make informed decisions about anything in a business.
Right.
That, I think, is, we cannot lose sight of that as being one of the most important things.
Yeah, and senior decision makers talk about risk all the time.
So
if you're a small business, like my small business is going to turn 8 years old in another 2 or 3 months. And for the first several years of its existence, the biggest risk we faced was product market fit. Like, how can I figure out how to serve people in a way that they will say, yes, please, we will sign up for that. That was like the number one risk to our future and our ability to succeed and be a viable organization. And every other risk that was facing me paled in comparison, because if I didn't get the product market fit risk sorted out, then none of that other stuff would have mattered.
Yeah,
So when
and
you go to senior decision makers, realize that they're dealing with way more risks than what you're talking about.
it's true, and that's really great because continuing on with 830, it tells us that organizations conduct risk assessments to determine risks that are common to that organization's core missions or business functions, its mission or business processes, its mission or business segments, common infrastructure and support services, or information systems. Right? You can
Yeah.
use risk assessments for many purposes. They can be used to design and develop InfoSec programs and systems. You can use it to create definitions for connectivity requirements, which, let's be honest, is one of the most common things in today's world. You can use it to figure out how authorization is determined for use or access of information systems. I mean, all of this stuff are real day-to-day decisions that have to be made. And, generally speaking, it's best if you make those decisions using a technique other than flip a coin or because I feel like it.
Or guessing.
Or
right?
guessing.
Or listening to what vendors tell you is most important, right? Which is horribly biased if they're trying to sell you a product. Or just, watching news feeds, right? Listening to sensationalized news stories. If that's how you, attune yourself to what's risky in the world, then that's also incredibly biased and not very useful. So where you get your risk assessment information is super, super important. And I also want to say that one of the things I try to encourage people in the information security community to do is to focus on these core processes, which is another reason why I love 800-30, because senior decision makers are very focused on this, right? They got to get their sales function working and keep it working. They have to fulfill the orders that they receive, and they have to collect the money that people owe them, and they have to pay the people who provide services, right? So they have to pay their vendors. And when that stuff falls apart, it can destroy the business. So I always tell InfoSec people to get out there and understand how those processes work, and then figure out where are the information assets in there, and get busy securing them, because that's what's going to make senior decision makers get really interested in your work, is when you focus on those core business processes and functions. So anyway, just reinforcing what you said here.
Yeah, no, it's very important. And I think too, so as we continue to kind of move through this and define terms, we already talked about what risk is, right? It was the measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance, taking into account the the impact and the likelihood of occurrence. So risk assessment then is the process of identifying, estimating, and prioritizing, in this case, information security risks. And we already hinted at this, right? You actually said the phrase risk assessment methodology, and we need one if we're going to assess risk. It's definitional. And what is a methodology? Well, it's going to consist of a risk assessment process, of which gap analysis, as you gave one example. This is something that I think does not get well represented or discussed enough, is an explicit risk model that is really defining key terms and accessible risk factors, right? I mean, just because we want to talk about threats and vulnerabilities and impacts and all these different things, trust me. Well, you don't have to trust me because you've done it yourself for your entire career. I've done it myself as well with different clients who haven't gone through the process completely. And let me tell you, as you no doubt know, it is painful if we don't have clear definitions for these types of things.
Oh, yeah.
And then you need
the problem of overloaded terms already.
Yes. And then you need to have the assessment approach. And that's where we get into quantitative versus qualitative and or semi-quantitative. And remember, too, that that approach has to describe the range of values that we can use and how different combinations of risk factors are identified and analyzed, so that those factors can be functionally combined to actually evaluate risk. I cannot tell you the confusion that I have seen on people's faces as, you take what seems to be these relatively simple formula and tables and then you try to apply it to any given situation, and oh my Lord, it just becomes so much more painful.
I'm getting nauseous just listening to you.
I know. And then, the last thing we need as part of our risk assessment methodology is an analysis approach. And there's a lot of different ways to think about this. It can be threat oriented. You can instead focus on assets and impacts, or vulnerabilities, right? Those are just some different ways to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
or patches, right? I mean, I see people focusing on all kinds of interesting things to, put at the center of their risk assessment work. One thing that I think is important to say is that I see most people, and I've done this a lot in the past. I see most people in our line of work trying to go from the bottom up, right? Trying to say something like, our biggest problem is we don't patch systems fast enough. Well, is it? I mean, you're sitting right next to it. And so you must have some perspective there that there's a problem. But is that really the biggest, cyber risk that we're facing?
It probably isn't. Let's be honest.
No, it probably isn't. Probably the biggest cyber risk we're facing is that we don't have any indemnification language in our contracts around third-party risk. I mean, maybe that's the biggest.
Or it might be that we don't know how many different cloud services our people are using unofficial accounts. Like that's probably a bigger cyber risk than our patching.
Right. Now, and that's why I think doing risk management from the top down is something we haven't done enough of, and I really enjoy promoting that as a risk assessment approach.
So, Kip, is there a limit to the number of risk assessment methodologies that an org can use?
I don't think so. I don't think there's really a limit, but I think you have to be careful, right? I don't think it's a good idea to have a risk assessment method of the week. I mean, I've made that mistake as I cycled through different tries. Like, well, I'll try this, and in the search for something that works can confuse senior decision makers rather than provide clarity.
So there's two words here that I want to hone in on that I think are great. And SP 830 talks about the key being to increase the reproducibility and repeatability of risk assessments. And if you don't have that, you can't really get the data you need. And that's the problem with doing a risk assessment of the week, right? And I think, again, words are, important. And let's quickly define. So reproducibility is the ability of different experts to produce the same results from the same data. In other words, you did the risk assessment and came up with this result. Can you give the methodology to your friend, Rob, and have Rob do the exact same? Does he go to the same spot? That's really important.
Yeah, but now you're blinding me with science, Jake. That's what we're talking about here, right?
Sort of. But then the other one is repeatability, and that's the ability to repeat the assessment in the future in a consistent manner. And I think
science.
It is science. But I also think about the technology or the technique, that we have used with our clients, and it is designed to be both reproducible and repeatable. That's otherwise, you can't look at. Otherwise, you don't get to see trends. You don't get to see anything over time, and that's really, really important.
It's super important because you go back to what we said early on, which is that risk assessment is not a one-time thing.
Exactly. So I told you this. Well, we both knew this was complicated, but hopefully our listeners are now agreeing with us. So,
well, I'm going to watch our podcast listening statistics and figure out where people are actually tuning out on this particular episode.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a feeling this could be a popular one just because it's such a core issue for our audience.
I hope we're doing a good job of unpacking this. Dear listeners, you can tell us if we totally got it wrong. You know how to find us.
It is hard, and I suspect that I've bitten off more than we could chew on for one episode. So this will probably become a two-parter. May not be a two-parter back to back, but I'm sure we'll revisit this. But before we summarily just give up, let's talk about risk models.
Okay.
A risk model defines the risk factors to be assessed and the relationships among those factors. And look, SP 830 is your friend here.
Yep.
There are all kinds of characteristics used in risk models as inputs to determining levels of risk. In fact, as Kip said, they do have tables of risk assessment methodologies. They also have tables full of quantitative and semi-quantitative ways of, and even qualitative ways of looking at threats and vulnerabilities and all that stuff. It's really, really helpful document.
Think about your audience. Don't think about what you like. That's what you like isn't first. What the audience is going to connect with, that's first.
Yep. And then, so here, by the way, is where we get to those terms that I remember from my CISSP studying. So a typical risk factors, according to 830, include these terms: threat, vulnerability, impact, likelihood, and predisposing condition, which is just a way of saying, it's kind of a vulnerability. And here's what I love, Kev. Talk about great words, great language. One can continue to, quote, decompose these factors into sub-factors. As an example, threats can be decomposed to threat sources and threat events. And let me tell you, based on personal experience working with a client, you really actually do need to do this, because what's going to happen is you're going to go along and at a high level, everything is going to seem great. You're going to feel really good about your awesome risk assessment methodology and how you're managing risk. And then someone's going to say, okay, how do we apply it to this situation? And suddenly there's a likelihood that it's all going to come crashing down, and you're going to realize that as cool as everything looked, it does not survive contact with reality. And these
you wouldn't know this firsthand, right? This is from research you've done.
No, this is honestly, this is the type of thing I think you only learn from firsthand pain, right?
I've been there.
Yeah. So okay, this just means that you've got to define these terms and get them as straight as you can before you get too deep into the weeds. Because if you don't, it'll create a gigantic mess.
Yeah, and be consistent. And if necessary, I don't think it's patronizing to your audience to actually hand out a sheet of paper with terms on it. I really don't think it's patronizing, because this is hard. This is hard, and everybody needs to be on the same page. But okay, look, I get the idea about a second part to this episode, but I actually think we can get through everything that's left and not have to create a second, like a part one, part two. Let's try to run through these typical factors. All right. So, like, what are the terms that have to be, everybody has to be on the same page with? Well, one of the common ones is threat. And what is a threat? Well, it's any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact the organization, disrupting their operations, destroying their assets, whatever it is. And this is a complex concept, and it can be further broken down. I don't think we should do that in this episode. I think we should let people break it down or decompose it in whatever way makes sense for them. But there are threats, there are vulnerabilities, and predisposing conditions. I don't tend to use that turn of phrase very much, but
you can blame 834.
Yeah. But these are weaknesses in an information system, or in procedures, or in some internal controls that you're relying on, or the way that technology has been implemented. Or, we talk about 0-day, vulnerabilities and that sort of thing, right? So I think we talk about vulnerabilities an awful lot. And so that's probably a term that is unlikely to be misunderstood compared to all the other ones, right? But importantly, vulnerabilities are exploited by threats. That I think is something we need to hang on to. Likelihood of occurrence,
and then don't forget the. I think it's actually super important to remind folks that a vulnerability sitting around doesn't do anything, right? The question is, can it be exploited by a threat source?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Boy, have I had a lot of arguments about people who told me that was a theoretical vulnerability. And until I could demonstrate it, they wouldn't take it seriously, even though I knew that, that it was an issue, because I knew there were cyber attackers out there who were actively exploiting it, and but I had to bring that evidence in order to get somebody to pay attention to it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have bug bounty programs, and why people want to see us, like when we do network penetration tests. They want us to show evidence that we actually accessed a sensitive system or whatever. And sometimes they want us to actually show them how we did it. It's not enough to write about it. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. A couple other key terms: likelihood of occurrence, very tough to estimate, but it refers to a weighted risk factor based on probabilities that a given threat will exploit a given vulnerability. And you can decompose likelihood into several different subparts. And likelihood is one of the things that I think I've fought the most with other people about. How likely is this to happen? How many times a year? How many times a week? It's difficult. I mean, you're talking about a crystal ball here. And so I know that if you use advanced statistics, you can do a good job of this. I just don't know if your typical senior decision makers will understand what you're saying. And then impact. So impact maybe is the simplest idea, but again, it's guesswork, right? But it's the magnitude of harm that you can expect to experience as the result of a successful exploited vulnerability.
Yep. And like all of these different things, you can use a quantitative or a qualitative or a semi-quantitative approach. For example, for impact, we could say something could be, that's going to hurt real bad, or that won't be so painful. That would be a qualitative approach, right? And then a full quantitative approach is, well, that impact is going to be $700 versus $700,000, right? Okay, and then look, there are other aspects of risk to consider, right? In case it isn't clear by now, there is a lot of uncertainty. That's another key term in 830. In all of these different terms and concepts, it has to be considered.
Some people actually think uncertainty is a synonym for risk.
Well, in some ways it is.
Yep.
And you can see why, right? Because by the time you break risk down into all of its component parts, and then you think of all the different uncertainty at each of its component parts, like it just exponentially increases the uncertainty. One thing you might want to do when considering risk, particularly at a big organization, is aggregate the risk. Roll that stuff up to higher and higher levels to get a more relevant understanding for the highest levels of decision makers.
Yeah. We didn't talk about frequency, did we? Did we talk about frequency?
No, but I think
likelihood.
Frequency and likelihood. I think that how you said likelihood can be decomposed into several subparts. Frequency would be a subpart of likelihood.
Okay. Now the reason why this is coming up real quick is because if a risk is small in the way that you've assessed it, but you're only looking at one one materialization of it, but it materializes a lot. In other words, it has a high frequency but a low cost. When it does happen, well, then it starts to add up. So you can't ignore that.
And of course, we have a cinematic example of that in the classic film Office Space, where the threat actors, in this case, the main characters, skimmed fractions of a cent off of every single transaction that went through their company. Right. And, individually, microscopic impact. On the other hand, the frequency was thousands of times per minute, and it really did add up.
It's snowballed way beyond what they expected.
Precisely. So it's whenever I can toss in an Office Space reference, Kip, I appreciate it. So that was good.
That'd be great.
So that'd be great. Let's wrap up this episode then with a discussion of assessment approaches. And I know you said we could get through it. I think maybe that's true, but I'll be honest. I already built in the idea that we probably need to go to another episode. And I think we will, but let's talk about the assessment approaches. So, we have some pretty strong opinions here. The approach to assessing risk is going to determine so much about the overall process. Do you want to take that fully quantitative approach that Kip has mentioned over and over again as requiring a lot of advanced math, a ton of time, a ton of effort, a lot of money? Or do you want to do a qualitative approach? Green, yellow, red. It's not I don't think either of us would say that it is an utterly useless approach devoid of any value at all. It's not. That wouldn't be fair. Or do you want to take a semi-quantitative approach where basically you smash the two together and see what you get?
Find a middle ground, yeah.
Yeah. And what do you think, Kip? Like, let's wrap it up talking about this.
Yeah, I think I'm going to repeat something that I said, which is it's about the audience. Think about your senior decision makers. Think about the people who own the risk that you're trying to assess, and think about how they'd like to see you talk about it. Don't say, well, I want to put, FAIR as a quantitative risk management method or risk assessment method. I want to put that on my resume. I want to get good at it, so I'm going to use that. That is like the tail wagging the dog, and I don't think you're going to be successful. So use some empathy and try to figure out what your senior decision makers are going to want to see. I made a mistake one time. I was working with a customer who was the head of an engineering firm and had actually come up through the engineering firm as an engineer. I thought for sure this person was going to want to do some probabilities and Monte Carlo simulations and so forth. And they said, no, I don't have time for that.
So
it was funny.
at the risk of going another 10 minutes, which if we do is fine, I have a question for you here, Kip. And I think it's really a request for a story, because what I love nothing more is to have those aha moments when something that you brought to me years ago and have been using and developing for many more years than that suddenly smacks right into this NIST special publication. And that is the semi-quantitative approach that we have used with our clients, affectionately, known as our 0 to 10 measurement scale. So maybe just tell our audience, how did you get there? What was the story? What's the origin story of the 0 to 10, how we measure risk scale?
Well, I appreciate you asking, and I'll give you a thumbnail type response. I just got fed up with red, yellow, green, and and probabilities and all these different statistical approaches. And I just sat down one day and I just said, what is it really like in the real world? Can I learn anything from just seeing things happening day by day in my work? And what I realized was there's really 3 states of security. There's no security or very little security. There's acceptable levels of security, and then every now and then there's too much security. And I realized that is what most people experience. And so if I wanted to talk to people about how much security we needed, that would be a good basis for grounding the conversation on. But then I said to myself, okay, but that's still pretty squishy. How can people tell me whether the amount of security they have is too little, the right amount, or too much, right? So like, my porridge is too cold, my porridge is too hot, my porridge is just right. How do I capture that? And so I thought, well, let me see if I can figure out how to put a little pain scale next to it. So anybody who's ever gone to the doctor and you're in pain, you probably have seen the little chart they show you, right? Where you have like 0 to 10, and 0 is like no pain, there's a little happy face, and 10 is like, I can't breathe. And there's like this red, really super unhappy looking, emoji face staring at you. And then there's all kinds of choices in between. I latched onto that and I thought, well, that's super practical. But then I realized, okay, well, that is not the continuum I'm trying to describe. I have a different continuum. And so I borrowed the 1 to 10, measurement. And then I threw a 0 because I realized that if anybody ever said, Kip, I have no idea what you're talking about. We don't do any security for that thing. Then I needed to be able to capture, absolute 0. I needed to be able to capture the other extreme, which is we have so much security, I don't even use that system anymore. And then the other thing I realized too was that there was more granularity on not enough security than there was on too much security. So I kind of skewed the numbers a little bit so that there would be more like 0 to 4. There would be 5 possible places where you could say we don't have enough, but there's only two numbers on too much. So anyway, that's kind of how it all came around.
And what do you think is the benefit of having this truly semi-quantitative as opposed to either red, yellow, green, or even worse, Kip? We've both seen it. Yes or no?
Yeah. Well, what I learned is that if you're going to do top-down risk assessment, it's really helpful to talk with people about that. And I've done top-down risk assessments where I did have interviews with people, but they were free-flowing, unstructured interviews. And when I aggregated all my interview notes, I had a hard time really understanding what was most important. I could kind of pull out themes, but I wasn't always able to actually point to anything in particular. So I found that lacking. And so I realized that if I could ask people questions and get them to give me numbers in return, then I could use kind of polling, right? I could use the kind of approach that that organizations have used for decades. If they want to ask people how engaged they are on the job, they pull together a sample audience, and then they go and they ask questions. And so I realized that would actually be workable, that I could actually engage with people, find out what they know, do this on a top-down basis. But then when I was done talking with them, I would have maybe 1,500 or 2,000 data points. And then I could do a little statistics, very, very lightweight amount of statistics on that data set. And then I could actually learn something useful.
So Kip, and this is not in the script, and I'm just going to toss you some slow softballs here. But if our listeners like what they're hearing, and by the way, folks, this episode is sponsored by Cyber Risk Opportunities and Kip Boyle, author of Fire Doesn't Innovate. I'm joking, but also not. So obviously, yes. Your book, we've mentioned it before. The book Fire Doesn't Innovate, your book, does talk about this process. What if someone is like, I just want to watch a video? What do you got?
Oh yeah. So we just put a Udemy course up. It's called Implementing the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and I'll put the URL in the show notes. You could typically buy that course for $10 to $20 when it's on sale. Get a coupon code. It's very inexpensive. And if you watch that course, you'll see how I use the 0 through 10 scale in order to conduct a gap analysis on the NIST cybersecurity framework compared to your organization. That is a risk assessment. And then what we do is we take that, we prioritize the results, we figure out a mitigation plan, we prioritize those, and then we make a risk management implementation plan. And so get the whole thing if you go get that NIST course.
All right. Well, I think that's a wrap.
Almost. One more thing I want to say.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I recently released a course on LinkedIn Learning. So if you have access to that, and if you just want to just go a little bit deeper in the concepts that we covered today, including 800-30, as well as some of the ISO standards and so forth, and a lot of very practical examples of how to do risk assessment and risk management in the field, then you're going to want to take this course. It's called IT and Cybersecurity Risk Management Essential Training. It's in the LinkedIn Learning Library, and that has a completely different pricing model. I'm not going to get into it, but I'll put the URL to that course in the show notes too. There you go.
Okay.
That's what I wanted to say.
All right. Well, we all know that I can't wrap up an episode. That's always you.
All right. That wraps up this episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Today, we talked about an incredibly complex but crucial concept, and that's assessing risk and all of its related issues. And we hope we did a good job for you. And we hope we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. If you need to overcome a cybersecurity hurdle that's keeping you from growing your business profitably, then please visit us at cr-map.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.